Tyler Carpenter is, I'm just reading to start with, but from the bios, but Tyler Carpenter is a practicing clinical forensic psychologist and family member, and a longtime member of ISPS and contributor to almost every conference we ever had, I believe. So I give you Tyler.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think from watching, listening to you and Brian over time, I suspect that there are a fair number of. Oh, you're talking about ISPS-US though. So maybe I have presented it at almost everyone. I don't know. Um, Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. Um,
Yep.
to add a little so that I think some people may know and other people may not. I got into this business because breakdowns run in my family. My father's father, who was a banker during the Depression, and my dad, who was a Marine on Okinawa during the Second World War, had breakdowns. Those things, as all of us who are family members and sometimes clinicians know, go by different names, and even the treatment over time evolves. So I've seen a lot of names, I've seen a lot of treatments, and as a family member, I guess family therapy really got started when I began treating people in training in the 70s. So the reason I mention this is that I believe that in part is how I got to ISPS, but also, like all of you who may have personal experience in your families, it involves a lot of thoughts, feelings, and experiences over time. And I think initially I found myself, as I went into training, quite angry at established psychiatry and treatment. I knew what the best of treatment had to offer because my family's members had been in some of the best hospitals. I also knew what it didn't offer, and when I set out, when my dad got sick when I was in college, that was the first time I'd actually ever seen a breakdown unfold. So there were, back in those days, there were basically two kinds of treatment that were available. One was hospitalization, either in a state hospital or in a fancier place like the Institute of Living or McLean or Shepherd Pratt or Chestnut Lodge or one place like that. And we're familiar with that kind of treatment from some of the founders of ISPS. Or there was psychoanalysis. And I didn't really, as a family member, I didn't really feel that I belonged in one place or the other, and I felt I had to become a psychologist, so I began exploring. So we just had Aaron Beck die. I had started out my own personal therapy. I couldn't hop on the couch. That just didn't work for me. It felt too crazy. So I went to Al Ellis for about a year, and that might be called a parameter of technique, if you will. He called it rational emotive therapy. And Aaron Beck wasn't to come along for a few years, and he was much politer, a little easier going, but they were both analysts. I mention these things because my experience and what I bring to it is that essentially my training was St. John's University clinical program, being close to New York, listening to everybody who ever treated somebody who was had an experience of extreme states or psychosis or breakdown or whatever term we want to use. I'm kind of indifferent to those things. I know what they mean, but they change over time, and everybody's got a different reason for using one or not using one. Every time there was a new therapy, I tried it out, a family therapy or a new person that came along that was promised some kind of an answer. I would read their books. I would be in therapy with him or go to the conferences. And so what I'm going to present today is what I've evolved over time. I worked in inpatient units for a while. I've worked outpatient. I've been a fellow at McLean. I did 10 years of research on schizophrenia. It was a biological program at McLean. The head psychologist was a psychoanalyst and a psychopathologist. His name was Philip Holzman. He was a professor at Harvard. And then I worked for 10 years as a fellow under him, and then 13 years in prison. And now what I do is what Julie said. I do forensic work. I do present at conferences on psychosis and integrating therapies and prison work, and I do disability evaluations, and I see patients primarily by Zoom, couples, individual, and that. And so what I'm going to present here are some things that seem to me to be important. I don't belong to a particular school. I'm familiar with them. And because I've worked in different settings, and invariably involves working with people that are labeled as troublesome or diagnostically one way or the other, that's the basis for the way that I work. And the title, "The Past is Never Dead," in fact, it's not even the past, is a statement from Faulkner, William Faulkner, the Nobel laureate in literature, who was a Southerner. Half of my family comes from south of the Mason-Dixon line, and great writer and an alcoholic, among other things. And I think it's a marvelous way to talk about relating to other people. I enjoy reading almost everything that's written in philosophy and biology and psychopharm, but I have never been persuaded to adopt a particular vocabulary except for the purposes of communicating with other people and reading the literature. So my sense is, and I'm going to put the slides up here now and try and move through them fairly quickly, is that when we meet in a session, particularly when we're dealing with very challenging experiences, whether it's an active acute episode of extreme experience, although in my experience that's involved dealing with homicidal people, which is pretty extreme in my my experience as well. When we meet with extreme experience, we're meeting face to face with ourselves and someone else, and we're creating something in which something is supposed to happen. And in that place, there's the past, there's the present, there's the future. And it's a bit of a mashup. They're all going on at the same time. And in my experiences, I have had it over time, how successful we are in dealing with it has a lot to do with the ability of all parties there to be able to make a place in which some kind of connection and communication can happen. And that could be quite challenging. All right, I'm gonna, I think this, yeah, the abstract reads as Faulkner and mystics of all eras have observed, the past and the present are never just that. I'm going to try and take 5 themes that I think are important. I picked the themes on the basis of my experience as a clinician and a researcher and a family member, and that is what these themes come from. And it's always moving. Heraclitus, the ancient Roman philosopher, suggested that we never step in the same stream more than once. And he similarly suggested that the only constant is change. And so that is very much a part of the theme I want to emphasize. The first thing I would say is the past is always present, and it can stifle the possibilities of the present for all involved. And what I mean by that is we're all very different. We may meet in a space, somebody may be exhibiting symptoms, we may be there by because it's a police standoff, because it's a family confrontation, because it's an acute episode on a locked unit. It's a therapy session. And no one comes to those situations and creates a space without bringing all kinds of things, including models that we've had or exposed, or feelings that we've been exposed to, or certain feelings that we try to use to make sense and help that session, that relationship to become productive. Now it's full of the models or the past that we bring to it is full of internalized images and narratives. Part objects, self objects, if that's a way one has of looking at it. It certainly is a way in which we develop, and according to some theories, that's what's going on when we meet with one another. I think it's fair to say that that's present. And trauma. If you were working with extreme experience, trauma is almost always a part of that, whether it is extreme as one session I had in which we were running a group and all of a sudden one of the members was describing an experience with an abusive father which erupted into violence, and the next thing we knew we were all sitting in a group with somebody who was actually living out that trauma in a group setting, or whether it's something that's being talked about. And that can certainly be the case when we're dealing with trauma. And sometimes their voice is present, and sometimes the voices are the little person inside ourselves that might be talking to ourselves. It may be a less dissociated consciousnness, or it might actually be voices themselves. Models are just that. I love models. I love thinking about things, but I have yet to meet the model that explains everything. And sometimes it seems to me as though talks, books, therapy sessions are cluttered with models. They're not about what's going on. They're about how people construct and understand what's going on. A few of these models are biosocial, environmental, medical, integrated. I'm sure there are many others I could pick, but I think that's a part of every therapeutic gathering that we have. Extreme states in a creative rebirth are points of shared consciousness, pre-consciousness, unconsciousness for all involved in the therapeutic encounter. And I say this having lived through that period and spent a fair amount of time reading about R.D. Laing and listening to mysticism as a good description of psychosis, an exchangeable model. I can see elements of that. Certainly there are experiences we have in which we feel the boundaries fall away and we feel ourselves at one with the people in the session. We feel ourselves at one with the world that we're in. It's very hard to distinguish that kind of description as separate from some of the other experiences that people have. I remember listening to Carl Whitaker, the famous Wisconsin psychiatrist who toward the end of his life was insisting on bringing in 3 generations of a family if he was going to deal with psychosis. And that's quite interesting. What Whitaker said was one time one of the members in the family in the group he was working with had a negative hallucination of him and he disappeared completely. Now that's about the most extreme I've ever heard a therapist describe their experience in a group, but that was Carl Whitaker. Whitaker could go to some very unusual places in working with people. I think participants all see one another differently. Now, these statements on here sound like sort of duh. Well, what have I come to listen to Tyler talk about things that are patently obvious? Well, in the practice of therapy over 35 years, I think I find myself sensitive to the ways in which people do see one another differently and see the other people there differently and how different changes. We're very much aware of the differences in roles and status these days. If one's been involuntarily hospitalized, that is certainly something that changes how everybody sees things. I, at one point, was involved in having to hospitalize my dad some years after I got my PhD, and I had finished my year as a fellow at Harvard. He and I had a conversation in which I told him if things had been different when I was in college, maybe he would have hospitalized me instead of getting hospitalized himself. It was a father-son exchange on a level that we didn't typically have, and I was very honest about it. I think sometimes who gets hospitalized and for what reason is iffy. I don't know that I reduce everything to power. I know I don't reduce everything to roles and status, but I know they're always important. Patients clearly have different amounts of power and goals. I try, whether I'm working in a prison with very dangerous people or I'm working in a unit with very individuals who would be classified as psychotic, or I'm doing an outpatient work, I try to maximize and minimize the role of power. I don't like to operate. In England, when I went to interview with Her Majesty's Prison Service, I think in the 90s, they called it management by relationship, which I thought was a nice way to work. I think we can all work with people in ways that reflect our connections. I'm not recommending that as a place we all start from, but I never called anybody in using a panic button in the prison, and I work with murderous people for years, and they could even get pretty angry. I think that, and I remember one time working as a psychiatric assistant on a unit with a guy that was having hallucinations of airliners dive bombing the locked hospital. Now we were close to an airport, but airliners were not dive bombing the hospital, and he was so convinced that this was the case and was so worked up he pulled the toilet bowl out of the floor. And I was still able to walk with him to the quiet room. So I think that relationship is tremendously powerful, and you don't really want to call anybody else in unless people's health and well-being are involved. I don't think that power and goals mean an awful lot at times. When I worked in maximum security prison, officers and correctional staff were more inclined to see whether you could handle things and people were safe when you were in a particular place before you could be a doctor, but that wouldn't mean very much if the situation was potentially dangerous enough that people could get hurt. So powers and status mean something, but that varies quite a lot in my experience. And I think experiences can and are seen and understood very differently depending on participants, events, and contexts. Now, at this point, people might be wondering, well, these are awfully general statements. Why make them like that? Well, I've seen over time, as I've bounced around and worked in different places, that there are certain themes that go beyond just therapist characteristics and relationship characteristics and setting characteristics. And they're ways of working that I think transcend a lot of the vocabularies and the models. So I'm inclined to talk more about general observations that I've had and things that I bring from inpatient or prison to outpatient work in more general ways. I think meaning making is consequential, and it varies according to goals and context. Crisis resolution, resolution of intrapsychic, interpersonal, familial, public, and forensic can really change regarding context. Being in a police standoff with a highly agitated character disorder at their home is not the same as facing somebody naked threatening to kill themselves in a segregation unit with people dressed up in uniforms, which again is not the same as talking with somebody who's coming to a session talking about the breakup of long friendships. All of these involve crisis resolution in one manner or another, but the qualities that one brings, what one can do, again, that varies quite a bit, but it varies as a function of context, both the external constraints and the internal ones. I think therapeutic context, whether it's an asylum, a prison, a hospital, a halfway house, group home, outpatient, again, it's no surprise, and it sort of seems like, well, that's kind of a does statement, Tyler. What are you telling us that for? These things exist differently. Well, yeah, and they make a difference, but I think they're things that are independent of all those settings. They both inform and they make those settings different. And I've worked in all those different settings and think that sometimes it's a question of borrowing the language. Sometimes it's a question of understanding the structure. Sometimes it's a question of modulating the distance one has. For instance, when I worked in prisons, I worked in a mental health unit. The way in which that works is if I'm feeling sarcastic, I'll say, well, that deals with the part of the brain that deals with mental illness. Well, for anybody that's got neurological, neuropsychiatric, neuropsychological treatment, we know there is no place where the mentally ill part resides. What's involved in a diagnosed mental illness, to use that term, involves a lot of different parts of the brain, and some of it's dynamic and some of it is more at the level of neuroscience finding. I think the parameters for resolution are a function of setting and social consequences. You can reduce something in a highly dangerous, secure setting with a joke. I'm the last person who would write a book or a paper on joke therapy and flog that at a conference. But I've been present when the capacity to spontaneously reduce a paradox and threat to a joke completely diffused the whole situation. I'm not going to tell you that is a therapy, although people like remember an exchange with Jay Haley around paradox, which frankly got annoying at one point, and I said as much to him. I think sometimes what happens is that our therapies reflect certain techniques or certain ways of looking at things which work and are therapeutic for a lot of reasons that are not about the technical structure of whatever it is that's done or not done. I think that varies. I think that's very clear from the psychotherapy research, which shows that techniques typically account for the smallest amount of variance and change. But I think you don't have to be a researcher to know that having an empty chair or doing a paradoxical intervention works and doesn't work for a whole host of different reasons that may say much more about your relationship with the client and the reason you're doing that technique and the situation that the client's in that you're trying to resolve with a technique. I think parameters for resolution are a function of the setting and the social consequences. Sometimes one can simply talk somebody down, or somebody can reassure somebody, and that actually works. I mean, we categorize these things by saying, and this was one of the first things that came to mind with me when I started my training. It used to be people would refer to supportive, re-educative, and I think it was reconstructive therapy. I think that was Wahlberg's book. And I remember reading it in class and trying it out with clients and thinking, wow, that's really weird. I don't think that one just does one thing, or one does another thing, or one can or can't do something in terms of the condition or the setting or whatever. I've used re-educative techniques, supportive techniques, exploratory techniques in all kinds of settings with all kinds of people. And I think that's really much more a function of being present with yourself and with somebody else when you're working. I think the goals we have are contractual and informed and consensual, and they depend on context and consequences. And by that, I don't necessarily mean informed consent. Written informed consent's tremendously important for therapy and important for forensic clinical relationships. It's important to let your clients know what you're going to talk about and the positives and the negatives, and to ask them about it and to inform them about it. But that, in my experience, has to be formal and documented on one end. On the other hand, I think it's an ongoing principle of how we work. If I am in a relationship with somebody and there are a number of things that come to mind, I don't I don't think about and discuss absolutely everything that I'm doing with my clients. But if there's something I have some questions about, or I think seems like it might be a good idea, I'll raise that and talk about that with the client at the time we're meeting. I think these days now, there are a lot of people out there who are put on medications of one sort or another. I think sometimes that's tremendously important. If my clients want to do that, we have a nurse practitioner who engages in it. But it's been my experience, when you work well with somebody over time, there are a lot of people who may have been put on antidepressants or anxiolytics by their PCPs and get to the point where they can actually operate without them. But it's kind of an unknown. I've read a fair amount of the literature. I've seen people on and off meds. It seems as though there's a better literature developing on people coming on and off antipsychotics, but there are a lot of people out there on antidepressants, SSRIs, anxiolytics, for whom medication is a way of looking at themselves and their problems. And for those folks, I think the discussions are much better made when they're provisional and they're mutual, and they involve some discussion with the person who's prescribing. And this is the last slide, and then I'm going to, hopefully I haven't exhausted people's interest in talking, but this is going to be the last one that I present, and I open things up for a general discussion or questions or whatever people would like. It occurs to me as I do this, if this is a puzzling format, when I started working in prison, one of the jobs of a psychologist was to deliver long educational talks to staff once a year. So we began with a 6-hour talk on suicide prevention, a 6-hour talk on mental health. And by the time I was finished, I was doing yearly groups of an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, and I typically pick it up with an introduction by each of the people in the group, their experience, and what they hope to learn by it. And you can really get into a lot of material and have a satisfying experience that starts and stops like that. So I'm kind of hoping this worked very well in a prison, and we've got a verbal educated group of people here, so I'm hoping that something like that may evolve with us. The last theme is play it as it lays. Now that's kind of a slang loosey-goosey thing, and maybe that's my unresolved adolescence and the fact that at 71 years old I'm sort of an aging flower child. But I really find that that works pretty well. That doesn't mean I regard therapy as somewhere to the left of Whoopi, but I think an openness to all the ways in which things can evolve is not unlike a very analytic approach, of which I have a great deal of respect, or even the experience of being on the couch and saying what comes to mind. Sessions often begin where they begin. Wilfred Bion was famous for not trying to keep his awareness open without preconceptions at the beginning of a session. I think that's a fine way to work, and that translates to play it as it lays for me, although that obviously means I'm bringing some things to the way in which I look at that way of working. I think what is understood, subject to civil discussion, processing, and resolution, varies in many ways, and context is in part, and it is co-created, I think, for me, suggests too much structure and too many people. I think it's more emergent than that. Being open to different understandings and ways of understanding allows for connections that support, provide space for therapeutic and adaptive growth and change. Now, in a way which that sounds like it's right out of a textbook, I wouldn't bet that it wasn't at some point. But what I mean by that is that having worked in some of the places I've worked in, between reading the papers, listening to other people talk about what was supposed to be happening and not happening, I think being open to different understandings is a lot more radical position to take than a lot of people think. That people say this is happening or that's happening, or this occurs for that reason or that, because of that condition or because of that kind of therapy, may touch on some of what's going on, but I think it also forecloses our openness to other possibilities.